Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this event presented in the American Inspiration Author Series. It's great to have you with us tonight in the land of history, art history, looking closely at the life and work of the American painter Winslow Homer, his inspirations and mission in the late 19th century. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event featuring author William R. Cross and his remarkable new work, Winslow Homer, American Passage. We're fortunate tonight that after Mr. Cross's 20-minute illustrated presentation, he'll be in dialogue with another special guest author and philosopher, John Kaag. Professor Kaag will also be posing your questions. Before we get started, some quick reminders and housekeeping items. We are in a Zoom webinar format, which means that your microphone is muted and your video is off. We can't take your comments in the chat box. Don't use that box, but please do look there for relevant information and helpful links. We asked for your questions as you registered. If you have additional queries, please do use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can. We got some great ones in early, but we would love some more. So please do input into the Q&A. A video of tonight's program will be shared with all of you, anyone who registered for tonight. The link will be emailed when it's available, the video, on the American Inspiration Video Archive, either later tonight or tomorrow. You are welcome to share that link with any and all friends. Of course, the real education comes from reading Bill Cross's remarkable book, Winslow Homer. Copies can be purchased through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Mass. Use the code AMINS22 as you order, and the book you receive will be signed by the author. Mr. Cross will be making a special trip to Cambridge to sign actual books, so no book plates for this one. Also, special for tonight, if you would like your book personalized, you can place whatever brief your words you would like in the comments field, just after you list the name, of course, that you want it personalized to, and after you list the code AMINS22. So you could say Happy Father's Day, congratulations on your graduation, thanks, happy birthday. All such things are possible. You simply need to order from Porter Square Books and fill out the comment field as you like. Now for some introductions. Our featured author tonight, William Cross, is an independent scholar and a consultant to art and history museums. He served as the curator of the nationally renowned 2019 exhibition, Homer at the Beach, A Marine Painter's Journey, 1869 to 1880. Bill is the chairman of the advisory board of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. He lives north of Boston on Cape Ann. John Kaag, our guest moderator, is the Donahue Professor of the Arts at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, and the author of, among other works, American Philosophy, Hiking with Nietzsche, and Idealism, Pragmatism, and Feminism, the philosophy of Ella Lyman Cabot. He is currently working on a book about Ralph Waldo Emerson. His most recent publication is Sick Souls, Healthy Minds, How William James Can Save Your Life. This book is also available, signed and personalized through Porter Square Books. Like our author tonight, for you, or maybe for your dad, John is making a special trip to the bookstore in Cambridge. Before we meet Professor Kaag, though, let's hear from Bill and see some pictures. Bill, it is really wonderful to have you with us tonight, and a hearty welcome to you. You have been on quite a tour with this book, lots of East Coast stops, and we're really glad to have you. Shall we get started learning more about Winslow Homer, the man behind the art? Over to you, Bill.
Thank you, Margaret, and Courtney, and the whole team, and thank you, John. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. Over the next 20 minutes, I want to introduce you formally to the exact contemporary of Mark Twain, but from New England, and who told his stories in image, not word. Like Twain, Homer knew what to leave out in order that he might engage his audience more fully. And also, like Twain, he sensed and shaped the essence of American identity. The work of Winslow Homer, as in this beloved centennial picture, has earned him the title of America's favorite painter. The images from his hand are so familiar that even Americans who do not know Homer's name do often know his work. Surprisingly, the life of the man who created these monuments of our culture is one about which until now we have known little. In examining that life, I hope that all readers may find resonance with our own lives and times today. Born in Boston to parents immersed in seaborne trade, even as a child, Homer was keenly aware of the economic, social, and moral tensions roiling the country, ranging from the panic of 1837, a year after his birth, to accelerating antebellum divisions over the greatest moral question of the day, slavery. Both his parents were devout Christians, but even in its faith, his family was riven with conflict. His mother and her nuclear family members practiced their faith at Boston's Park Street Church, where abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison preached a gospel of freedom. Homer's father, by contrast, worshiped at the nearby Bowdoin Street Church, led by another renowned preacher, Hubbard Winslow. Winslow declared that the best response to slavery was not agitation of the kind that Garrison propagated, in his view, but a calm and fixed rest of mind. Somehow, with robust trade between Boston merchants, many of them sitting in his pews, and well-meaning people in southern ports, and surely it would all work out. To say that Garrison disagreed with Winslow is putting it mildly. He described him as a prophet of Baal and effectively an apologist for slavery. Homer's father not only followed Hubbard Winslow's thinking closely, but persuaded his wife to name their newborn son after the pastor, and eventually to join her husband as a member of Winslow's church. His birthplace in the waning years of the Jackson presidency was set amid the clutter and stench of Boston's North End, adjacent to wharves where Winslow's father, an aspiring but failed merchant, sought in vain to find his fortune. The Boston Homer knew as a child was hub to trade with ports across the whole Atlantic world, beginning with the southern states of the US. Most importantly for the Homer family, Mobile, Alabama. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but there it is. Where 3 of Homer's 6 paternal uncles settled, 2 of them permanently. Exactly 1 year before Homer's birth, one of those uncles, whom he knew well, was shipwrecked on the Bahamian island of Eleuthera. By the summer of 1853, shortly after he turned 17, Winslow had begun work for a Boston lithographer, John Henry Buford, where he depicted, among other subjects, the moment in 1856 when Preston Brooks, a congressman from South Carolina, bludgeoned Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts on the floor of the United States Senate. Illustrated newspapers, invented in London only in 1842, came to America in the 1850s, bringing with them a new kind of print, the wood engraving. Homer quickly mastered the medium, with designs distinguished by their rhythmic geometry and suspenseful narrative ambiguity. They often included intriguing contrasts of light and dark, and a wry sense of humor. Homer's work delighted the brash New Yorkers at Harper's, who persuaded him to move there in the summer of 1859 when he was just 23. His skills became even more highly valued once the long brewing Civil War broke out, and demand rose even more for illustrated newspapers that could make sense of the distant but pivotal military action. Homer bore witness to the everyday drama of war, the life of the ordinary foot soldier, not the general. In so doing, he offered complex but accessible compositions that connected the men at the front to lives back home. He opens his narrative for the viewer to imagine the varied experiences of the war and to consider the outcome of the story Homer begins. In News from the War, for example, Homer hangs 7 panels from telegraph wires, each telling a story of news on the move. As always, Homer starts with particularity, even about a place he had never been. In a deliberately ambiguous scene, 3 pairs of figures appear on a street corner in Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. One of the 6 is a spy. Which one? The affluent white woman with her faithful hound? One of the wounded federal officers out for air from his prison on Tobacco Row? One of the men receding quietly into the background? Or the Black woman with a towering basket on her head? Decide for yourself which is the source of news from Richmond to the north. Homer opens his narrative for the viewer to imagine the quiet drama and to consider the outcome of the story he begins. Ever observing, he invites his own observers to share in his engagement with what he sees, to interrogate and complete it. Homer could sell a design such as News from the War for about $100, the equivalent of $2,700 today. In those days, the value of an oil painting like this one was similar, but Homer aspired to become not just an illustrator, he wanted to be a painter, and for that, he needed to paint. With his success designing illustrations of life in camp, he turned naturally to that same subject in his first canvases, such as this one. He chose the title with considerable care, Home Sweet Home. A man of few words, his titles were often as multivalent as his pictures. The subject of home permeated the Civil War for all those who had a stake in it. The enslaved who had no home, the Confederates who believed that only through secession could they retain their home, and the federal troops who fought ultimately for a larger mission, a reimagined home, an America anointed by God for his purposes. After the war, Homer spent 10 months in England and France, and then, upon his return, began the work for which he is best known. One of the ironies of his career is that before the late 1860s, this artist, now so closely associated with marine painting, had never made one. At 33, he exhibited his first oil of the sea, which he called Manchester Coast. The critics hated it, one writing that the most noticeable point appears to be the dashing of the ocean spray above the rocks, but as indicated by Mr. Homer, it resembles the work of a boy who has dashed a spitball upon a newly papered wall. Although with reviews like that, this painting didn't sell, Homer did not give up on marine subjects or other, usually outdoor scenes. He and other painters adopted a seasonal pattern for each year, including summers in the country making abundant field sketches and autumns when, in their New York studios, they converted them to new oil paintings. Although Homer could sell his illustrations year-round, Winter and spring were exhibition season, after which the cycle began all over again. Homer's seasonal pattern was far from solitary. He traveled with painter friends to, for example, the Catskill Mountains, where he made a series of pictures focused on children, often in or near their one-room schoolhouses, such as Snap the Whip. For 8 years, Homer lived and worked in the 10th Street Studio Building, a cultural hothouse filled with talented artists, several of whom likely encouraged him in 1873 to travel to Gloucester, Massachusetts, where by summer's end, Homer had produced 10 watercolors that he was willing to display, albeit with such hesitation that he gave none of them titles or prices. This suite of Homer's first exhibited watercolors was composed, like his wood engravings, in stark geometric shapes. The sheets embed a narrative ambiguity that draws his viewers into the stories Homer has begun, inviting their completion in the eyes and minds of those to whom he appeals. Some of the early watercolors reflect his affinity with Black children, such as this instance, one of many, of figures paired in contrast. Homer's outstanding talents as a painter in watercolor led him to create not only true masterpieces of American art, but among the greatest such works ever made anywhere in the world. They include a series of dramatic sunsets that he painted on a return trip to Gloucester in the summer of 1880, when he lived with the lighthouse keeper and his family on 10-Pound Island in the middle of the harbor, immersed in the magical meeting of land, sea, and sky. That long, productive summer led Homer back to England, where he spent 20 months primarily in the North Sea fishing village of Cullercoats near Newcastle. While he was in England, Winslow, his brothers, and their parents initiated a major new phase in the Homer family's life, and especially in his. The family bought a large chunk of Prout's Neck, a 150-acre promontory a dozen miles south of Portland, Maine, and Winslow remodeled a stable to become his home and studio. His first years at Prout's were ones of staggering productivity. Homer focused for the first time on the innate longing of all people for salvation, and on a theme that would engage him for another 2 decades of mid-ocean wreck and rescue, due in part, perhaps, to stories he heard on the deck of the Cunard steamship Parthia on his way to England. That theme of mid-ocean wreck and rescue sustained him for another 20 years, leading both to his remarkable oil, The Signal of Distress, and to the very last watercolor he ever exhibited. As mortal themes became central to his work, he created the famous contrasting pendants of the herring net and the fog warning, in which he sets a fruitful harvest of small fish that a pair of men catch close to shore against an uncertain outcome, as a solitary figure pursues large fish far out at sea at potential loss to his own life. A slump followed this period of intense productivity. Homer's slump became a depression. The pivot was his return in 1887 to the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York, where a dozen years earlier he had been inspired to depict a landscape in which another pair of figures appear, striking a contrast by age, height, and personality. At the clearing, a one-time Adirondack farm, now a club, Homer found both congenial companionship and the conviction that the words of his favorite author, an Anglo-Scots physician, were true. Everything bears the mark of order impressed upon it by the almighty hand. Homer's newfound delight in God's created world in which he immersed himself was as tangible as the trout he painted. He sees in awe the working out of an invisible but benevolent design. The trout have sprung from the rippled, nurturing shallows for a brief moment, just as has their prey. He catches all of it in mysteriously ordered balance, the fish, the bug, the lily pads, and the air he too breathes. Homer relishes the suspense of the moment and its extreme brevity for the three characters in his drama. His sense of wonder did not mean that he was blind to vulnerability and death, but rather that he believed in the sovereign hand of God, that this side of heaven requires that we see through a glass darkly, in faith that one day we may see face to face. So in Homer's largest painting, Fox Hunt, it is not the ravenous crows with which he empathizes, but the tired old fox, as, like the fox, his own signature sinks into the snow. 6 years later, in perhaps his greatest work, The Gulf Stream, he cast a muscular young black as an American everyman. The Metropolitan Museum of Art has placed this painting at the center of its exhibition Cross Currents, which opened last month and is the most ambitious display of Winslow Homer's work in more than a generation. The show's luminous watercolors and spectacular oil paintings reflect the role of tension born of conflict in Homer's paintings, particularly those made in his maturity. He presents them as tragedies in which he does not give away the endings. These dramas are the outcomes of an order that is observed and attended both by the Almighty, who made all creatures, and by Homer himself, who also cares about all that he, the human creator, has brought to life. By 1900, Homer had won a reputation for work whose visual significance to our culture was comparable to that of such giants as Walt Whitman and others in literature. Despite the recognition his work received, Homer's life changed little. Over all that life, in his close observation, his idiosyncratic yet skillful hand, and his heart for all he encountered, Homer practiced the principles he learned in his youth. He wrote that the life that I have chosen gives me my full hours of enjoyment for the balance of my life. The sun will not rise or set without my notice and thanks. On behalf of this gentleman and myself, thank you for joining us tonight. Margaret? John?
Bill, that was fantastic. Here comes John. Welcome aboard.
Bill, thank you so much for that. That was wonderful. And I have to say that the book itself is one of these books that you don't quite understand how monumental it is until you actually pick it up. It's quite heavy. And so congratulations. And let me ask you a few questions, some from the audience, and then some that have just sort of been lingering in the back of my mind for several weeks since I've finished the book. So let me start with a question posed by the audience, which is also one of mine, which is, how do you deal with a figure who is so elusive and private? And how do you make a book of it when he seems to defy every effort that a biographer might have to do so?
Homer is a hard nut to crack. There's just no argument around that. He left no diaries. He never married. He never had children. The letters that he wrote tell us rather little about his internal life. And so there is not as much to go on as many other contemporaries of his in terms of the written record. He did, however, leave a large body of work, and many of those oil paintings and watercolors and drawings have stories embedded in them. And looking closely at those, including inscriptions and who acquired a given work and under what circumstances, was helpful. It was also helpful to look at who was around him, and some of the people around him did give vivid descriptions of not only the times in which he was living, but also the specific context in which Homer lived. And so in as much as he was a Bostonian in his youth, a New Yorker in his the middle part of his life, and then living primarily on the Maine coast, but traveling quite a bit to Boston, New York, and the tropics over the last 27 years of his life. I could rely on an increasingly large amount of digitized information, including newspapers, as I tried to piece together the story through other people's hands, which ideally would be available directly from his hand. Does that help, John?
It does. Thank you. I mean, I think that a lot of readers and also a lot of listeners today wonder where we would place some of his most famous works, like this one. Yeah. And this also comes from the audience, and I know that there's some contention about where this might be. Could you also sort of respond to the question, where does this interest come from or curiosity come from to place the exact location of a painting? I'd be interested to know your response to that.
So Homer believed greatly in the particular and in the merits of closely examining the specific appearance of what was within his frame. But he framed his pictures with great care. And so the appearance that he was depicting was often a constructed appearance, because he was purposefully framing out things he did not want to include, and framing in things, sometimes by clever positioning of his figures that he did want to include. The picture on the cover of the book is two guides, or rather it's a detail of two guides, which is in the collection of the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown, Massachusetts. And the two figures on the cover, as I mentioned, strike a contrast by age, height, temperament. And I should leave it to those who are smart enough to read the book to let them discover the whole story of that contrast. But quite unusually, both of these two figures are specific people. So they are there with some history and with some associations in which Homer delighted, and which tie greatly to American identity and the tension that we have as a country between our our longing for home and our itch to look beyond the horizon.
I feel like you've just piqued our interest rather than quenched it, which is fine, which is exactly what you meant to do, I'm sure. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about what it was like for you to hunt down some of these paintings, and also where can you find some Homer paintings where they are placed in situ, meaning where they were originally purchased or bequeathed, and where viewers could see them today.
So there are wonderful collections of Homer's work at the Philadelphia Museum, at the National Gallery, at the Art Institute of Chicago, and at several institutions in and around Boston, including the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and the Addison Gallery in Andover and the Worcester Art Museum. There are a lot of fantastic things to see through July 31st at the Met. And I would say run, do not walk to the corner of 82nd Street and Fifth Avenue if you possibly can. But there are lots of other wonderful places to see Homer's work if you cannot get to New York within that time frame. In terms of the attention Homer paid to the particular, there is great delight in going to places that Homer depicted and being able to see the actual landscape as well as see his work. That's harder to do than you might think. His only trip west of Pittsburgh was briefly to Chicago when he went to the World's Columbian Exposition. In major cities, you are not likely to see scenes that he depicted in his art. He very rarely in his paintings depicts urban scenes. But the Cape Ann Museum in Gloucester, Massachusetts, which is where we where the show on the formation of Homer's work as a marine painter was, is a place that has a lot of glorious topography that Homer loved and painted. So that's sort of the exception. Prouts Neck, Maine has Homer's studio, which is owned by the Portland Museum. And Prouts Neck is a very special place to visit, but there's no Homer work on display, either outside or inside the studio.
I want to sort of ask a more philosophically oriented question or theological question. And you mentioned in your presentation that in the second half of Homer's life, he begins to address the human aspects of, well, how do we deal with our own mortality? How do we deal with the challenges of being human? How do we deal with facing the universe in a way that's authentic? And I was wondering if you could say a little something about that and what might have brought Homer around to that position or around to that theme.
So Homer was a remarkably observant man in every respect imaginable, to me at least, other than one, which is his religious practice. He did his darndest to avoid ever darkening the door of a church. And that's particularly striking in as much as both his parents were quite devout. And both in his letters and in his work, there is an unmistakable stamp of his grounding in certain beliefs but he tells it slant, as Emily Dickinson would say. He never, in my experience, actually uses the word Jesus in any of his letters, but he does refer with some regularity to God, and he does give a strong sense of his acute need for salvation and of there being a morality that is coming from a source greater than himself or any other human being. He also has this deep sense that there is a benign order that undergirds everything that is going on in the world. And in that, he gets to his faith, interestingly, in part, I believe, through science. And as the son and brother of inventors, he had a real interest in how things worked. And so his library and the circle of people around him included very interesting people who were often engaged with the science of seeing, whether that meant ophthalmology or optical physics. And I think that his intense curiosity about the way the world worked covered both a idiosyncratic faith and a deep interest in science to the extent that he could understand it in a practical way.
I want to, I'm getting so many questions from the audience, so many really good questions that I want to make sure that I prioritize them over anything else, to be frank, because that's why we're all here. So one question that came out of the audience was, where did Winslow Homer show his art? And I'm going to add the additional question, why did he show where he showed?
Great question. So until he was born in 1836, and he began showing his work during the Civil War when he was not yet 30. And during that period and leading up to the Civil War, there really weren't particularly successful galleries through which to sell art. So if you were an artist in the 1850s or 60s and you wanted to sell your art, you had two ways to do that. One was setting up an auction of your own work through one of a half dozen auction houses, which were generally in New York. Some of them were outside, but generally were in New York. Or again, with a New York focus, going to the National Academy of Design on bended knee and somehow getting your work admitted to especially the annual exhibition, which was in the spring every year. That was the be all and end all of artistic fame, getting into the annual exhibition of the National Academy of Design. There were other places. Brooklyn had an art academy, for example, but that was really the ultimate. Once the 1870s came along, there began to be viable commercial galleries. And Homer had a gallery in Boston on Park Street called Dahl & Richards, which put on an exhibition of significance to him for the first time in December of 1880. And most of what they showed were the watercolors from that very productive summer. And Homer also established a relationship with a Prussian-born dealer in New York, Gustav Reichart, who he was very loyal to, even past the point where Reichart closed his gallery and continued to operate privately. And then for the last dozen years or so of his life, Homer switched his allegiance to Knoedler, and Knoedler became his primary dealer after Reichardt's closed its doors.
So we moved into sort of the commercial aspect of art, and now we're going to veer back a bit to the religious. And this is a question that comes from our audience, but I was happy to see it come through. And I would encourage everybody to, we still have some time, and I'm very mindful of the chat. So send questions my way, please. So this is for Bill. So it seems that his religious leanings, if there are any, are deist or from deism and Unitarianism of a certain ilk. The sort that might have impressed or might have shaped Emerson, Thoreau, American Transcendentalism, and into William James, maybe even Henry James. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what that religious or spiritual mindset might be, and what you see in Homer's works when it comes to that.
Thank you. And I think I failed to answer completely the last question, which I'm going to try to weave into this one. I do not believe that Homer was grounded in a true transcendentalist or Unitarian or Universalist faith. I think he had too great an instinct for the paradigm of salvation and the need for personal salvation. He was too grounded in the particular and the incarnate to be content with the abstractions of transcendentalism, I believe. And I say that in part because I think he never lost track of the fear with which he grew up. He grew up in a very large family. He had 45 first cousins just on his father's side. But he was from the poor, the unsuccessful branch of the family. So he knew wealthy people, but he did not have any money growing up. And this sense of always being just a couple of steps away from collapse, I think was important both in his need to show work and make a living as an artist, particularly after he abandoned his work for illustrated newspapers in 1875 and became full-time, basically devoted to his work as a painter. And so I think it was grounding him, this sense of needing to find a way to keep going, I think was grounding him in a different kind of faith than than that of Emerson or of his ilk. It's worth recognizing that while there were lots of different forms of Christianity in Boston growing up, his mother's grounding at Park Street, with which he ultimately affiliated more closely than he did with Hubbard Winslow's church, which was I think one that he would have mocked in some respects, was quite distinct from anything approximating transcendentalism. It was an evangelical church.
A question that comes out of your discussion is, what sort of relationship do you see between, you said he left journalism, or rather his role as an illustrator in 1875. Do you see that lingering on in his later works? And then more broadly, what's the relationship between illustration in magazines or newspapers and Homer's work on the whole? And I won't take credit for that. That's from the audience as well.
So I believe that Homer was shaped in all of his work, illustration and fine art, by an understanding of the need for narrative. And even in his seascapes from the last decade of his life, I believe there is embedded narrative in that he stands in wonder before the ongoing reshaping of the created world through, for example, the 10-foot tides at Prout's Neck, which remake the appearance before his eyes, and the fact that over the course of a day, there is drama that is reshaping the appearance of nature. In some cases, there are obvious things like footsteps in the snow that show the hand or the impact of humanity on that landscape. Sometimes it's more subtle, a distant boat perhaps, or smoke coming out of chimneys. But there is an ongoing narrative character that I think ultimately can be traced back to his shaping as an illustrator, both in lithography and in wood engravings. It's worth observing that his career as an illustrator was always on, or almost always on spec. So he was never really employed by Harper's, for example. He was always selling his work to the art editor, who would then either accept it and assign it to a wood engraver to, in some cases, collaborate directly with Homer, and in some cases, do work while Homer was a distance away, but base that on Homer's drawings. But Homer was always in a position of selling that work and being his own boss. Does that help, John?
It does. I mean, as a bookish fellow myself, and I know that a lot of the audience is also in my category of folks, I'm curious to know what Homer read, if you know, because I know that it also might be elusive.
Yes. So I was very grateful that the Portland Museum of Art was recently given the bulk of Homer's library, or what we know of what survives from his library. And there were doubtless other books that he had that we cannot now identify. But one of them, which is the most annotated of all those books, is not the Bible, although he did have a Bible in his library, but a book which was a bestseller and was written by an Anglo-Scots physician who looked closely at the work of Darwin and Herschel, father and son, and Matthew Fontaine Maury, and a number of other figures of the late 18th and 19th centuries, scientists who were unveiling this intelligent design in the world. And he was making sense of those scientific breakthroughs by tying them to a particular passage of scripture, which is accepted as canonical in Catholic and Orthodox churches, and interestingly not among Protestants. Homer would likely have heard that passage of scripture sung, however, as a part of morning prayer directly across the street from his studio in Prout's Neck, because it was a very normal part of that lay-led liturgy in that particular church and in many other Episcopal churches.
I'm gonna have time for just one more question, and it sort of points forward beyond Homer into the future, but does so by way of what for us is our past. So I'm curious to know the sort of themes that you see in a line that runs from Homer to Wyeth to Harper. So I think that I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about first of all, where you see the themes that Homer initiated emerging in our previous century, and then where you might see them going in the future. And unfortunately, that's going to be the last one.
So I think all three of those painters, Homer, Harper, and more recently Andrew Wyeth, and I assume it was Andrew, not NC or Jamie Wyeth. I think all three of those painters found beauty in the natural and authentic light and colors of the New England coast, and sought that authenticity and sought to know it with particularity. For Harper, there was also a kind of flattening and the discovery of the abstraction in the particular, which was different from Homer. And I think Wyeth perhaps took even farther than Homer did the imperative to frame more acutely. And so all three great painters, when I look at painters today who are following in their footsteps, I'm hoping that there is a greater and unabashed embrace of beauty and a recognition that we as a people have had an awful lot of cynicism, and we would all benefit from a hearty and honest embrace of unity, head, heart, and hands.
I think we can't hope for very much more than that. I think about trumping imagination, or rather trumping cynicism with imagination, and it seems like that's what's at hand here. Bill, it's been a pleasure, and Margaret, thank you so much for this chance for me to ask a few questions this evening. So, Bill, thank you.
John, you did a beautiful job, and that was such a rich conversation and so amazingly illuminating. I feel so lucky to be going to New York at the end of the week and being able to attend the exhibition. So I'm just a lucky person. But as we do for all our American Inspiration Author events, we have asked Bill if he might read a brief passage from his book as a sort of last reflection. And Bill, if you want to take it away, that'd be great. John, thank you so much again. I'm so grateful for your time.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you, John. In 1855, Walt Whitman had written, "The proof of a poet is that his country absorbs him as affectionately as he has absorbed it." It took Homer's leaving the long, long anchorage of his American home for him to grasp more fully the profound truth of Whitman's insight. Through his witness of how completely and how affectionately visual poets such as Constable, Turner, and Millet had absorbed their countries, Homer had grown far more than the brevity of his 10 months abroad on his first trip to Europe might suggest. Now, in Whitman's words, his ship was clear at last. She leaps, she swiftly courses from the shore. Homer sailed back to the United States in October 1867, renewed in his distinctive calling. The illustration he drew depicting his fellow passengers as full of vigor, with strong diagonals and a stiff breeze. Homer knew now more than ever that another land awaited his absorption. That land was his own.
Bill, that is beautiful. You are such a lovely writer. And it's really wonderful to think of Homer gaining such strength from his country and from its literature as well, from Whitman. He had real pride in our country and he was sustained by it. And yet he sustained it, carrying it forward for all of us. And as you said earlier, carrying forward for us his sense of wonder, and with it, our sense of wonder. So I just have really enjoyed this evening. And I do want to remind folks that, of course, the real pleasure comes from reading and enjoying the images in Bill's book. Just a reminder, copies of Winslow Homer, American Passage can be purchased through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Mass. Use the code AMINTS22 as you order, and the book you receive will be signed by Bill. And if you like, also personalized to a name and add a happy birthday, happy Father's Day, thank you, whatever you want to say, place in the comments. Some brief words there. Tell the book staff what you want, bookstore staff. John Kaag's latest work on William James, who we referred to a couple times, Sick Souls, Healthy Minds, is also signed and personalized, available to you. So thank you for thinking to support these authors and independent bookstores, and by extension, this writer series. We at NEHGS are so delighted to have presented tonight's author event. If you're researching an artist, a family, or a community, a time in history, you will find it useful to visit our library and education center. The stacks on Newbury Street in Boston's Back Bay are now open to the public. NEHGS members can delve into our digital archives anytime, day or night, gaining access to 1.4 billion searchable family records. Free to the public, you can chat with one of our genealogists about any of your projects. And our Brew Family Learning Center hosts many educational programs aimed at all levels of historian and family historian. So if you're new to researching or you're a pro poring over the 1950 census, please check our website or see the links in the chat. For cultural programming, you'll see on screen a tour of Castle Howard that is coming up. And for you literary sorts, like John and me, and also Bill, We invite you to join us for any of our free virtual author talks. On June 7 at 3 p.m., we're welcoming the best-selling author Anne Leary with The Foundling, her new novel based on facts she uncovered researching her family. She'll be joined by Alex Green, a journalist and lecturer at Harvard Kennedy School. Together, they'll shed light on a dark corner of our country's history, the realm of eugenics. On June 20, we're hosting the Pulitzer Prize winning Harvard historian Annette Gordon-Reed. She'll discuss her new book on Juneteenth with Dartmouth professor Lisa Baldes. This event is in partnership with the Boston Public Library and the State Library of Massachusetts. Do join us in welcoming the paperback edition of Dr. Gordon-Reed's book. And on July 7 at 1 p.m., we'll gain the insight of two wonderful writers on the lives of women in the Gilded Age. The British author Laura Thompson will tell tales from her book, Heiresses, The Life of the $1 Million Babies. Betsy Prelot will look at the skyrocketing success of one woman business owner from that era, an equal of the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, drawing from her new book, Diamonds and Deadlines, about Mrs. Frank Leslie. Don't miss hearing from these women. This is just a few weeks before we host Julian Fellows, the creator of Downton Abbey and the Gilded Age series. Lord Fellows will be with us in person in Newport, Rhode Island at the end of July. But back to this evening. Our mission at NEHGS is to educate, inspire, and connect. We hope we've accomplished that tonight and that you'll come back for more book talks and educational programs. For now, from all of us behind the scenes in the Boston area, Bill on the North Shore, John just west of the city, and tech producer Courtney in Rhode Island, we wish you a glorious springtime. Thank you for joining us this evening and have a good night. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, John.